The hum began not as a roar, but as a vibration in the marrow of the bone, a low-frequency dread that trembled through the paper walls of Tokyo before the first shadow ever crossed the moon. It was a mechanical pulse, the rhythmic breathing of 1,000 silver gods carved from aluminum and spite, flying at altitudes where the air is too thin for human pride to breathe. For centuries the people of the archipelago had looked to the horizon and seen the dawn as a divine promise, a celestial mandate that the sun would never set upon the Yamato spirit. But on this night, the stars were being blotted out by something man-made and merciless. The air smelled of charcoal and old dust, a dry, expectant scent that precedes a storm, yet there was no moisture in the clouds, only the heavy metallic scent of high-octane fuel and the silent weight of a 1,000-year empire about to ignite. To understand the exact moment the sun went out, one must look past the maps and the casualty figures. One must look into the eyes of a nation that had been told it was impossible for them to lose. At the very second the first spark touched the tinder of their reality. The descent into the abyss did not begin with a crash, but with a whisper in the halls of the imperial palace, where the silence was so thick it felt like a physical weight upon the shoulders of the emperor. The floors of the Kiryu, the nightingale floors, were designed to chirp under the feet of assassins. But now they screamed under the weight of news that no one dared to speak aloud. The tide had not just turned, it had retreated so far that the jagged rocks of total annihilation were now visible to anyone who dared to look. In the bunkers beneath the city, the air was stagnant, smelling of stale tea and the ozone of radio sets that brought only reports of fire and retreating ghosts. The high command sat in a dim light that flickered with every distant thud of naval guns, their uniforms pressed and their blades sharp. Yet their faces were masks of porcelain, cracked by a truth they could not yet name. They were the architects of a new order. Yet they were presiding over a funeral pyre that stretched from the Solomon Islands to the jagged peaks of Okinawa. Outside, in the narrow alleys where the common folk lived, the reality of the war was not found in grand strategies, but in the emptiness of the rice bowl and the hollow look of mothers watching the sky. The propaganda spoke of a shattered jewel, a beautiful, collective suicide that would cleanse the world of the invader. But the stomach knows no such poetry. The hunger was a slow, gnawing beast, a reminder that the blockade had strangled the throat of the empire. The sea, once the source of life and the shield of the gods, had become a graveyard. The great steel leviathans of the Imperial Navy, the Yamato, the Musashi, were no longer symbols of power. They were iron coffins resting in the silent blue of the Pacific, their guns silenced by an industrial might that the Japanese soul could not comprehend. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a collapse, a silence where the lies of the state no longer have the strength to echo against the walls of the hungry. The sky over Tokyo finally broke on a night in March, a night when the wind was high and the heart was low. The B-29s came in low, their silver bellies reflecting the flickering fires below, like schools of predatory fish. This was not the precision bombing of factories or docks. This was the systematic erasure of a civilization's physical presence. The incendiaries fell like rain, but a rain that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The sound was a terrifying guttural howl as the firestorm created its own weather, sucking the oxygen from the lungs of those hiding in shelters, turning the rivers into boiling cauldrons. In that moment, as the wooden heart of the city turned into a landscape of white-hot ash, the psychological shield of the nation shattered. It was the realization that the divine wind, the kamikaze, was not coming to save them. The gods were silent, and the sky belonged to the enemy. A father, holding his daughter's hand as they ran toward the Sumida River, looked up and saw not the moon, but a canopy of orange flame that stretched from horizon to horizon. Deep within the subterranean nerve centers, the generals still spoke of the decisive battle, a final, bloody confrontation on the shores of the home islands that would force the Americans to sue for peace. They moved pins on maps that represented divisions that no longer existed, regiments of boys and old men armed with bamboo spears. It was a madness born of honor, a refusal to see the charcoal for the trees. Tojo and his cabinet were trapped in a loop of their own making, where surrender was a word that had been deleted from the Japanese language centuries ago. But even among the hardliners, a chilling realization was beginning to seep in. The reports from the front were no longer about victories or even honorable defeats. They were reports of a total, systematic dismantling of the Japanese soldiers' ability to fight. At Iwo Jima and Saipan, the world had seen the Gyokusai, the breaking of the jewel where thousands chose the cliff as edge over the enemy's cage. The enemy did not stop. They did not recoil in horror. They simply adjusted their sights and moved to the next island. Then came the morning of August 6th. The air over Hiroshima was clear, a beautiful, sparkling summer day that seemed to mock the darkness of the times. A single plane, a speck in the vast blue, dropped a single object for a few seconds. There was a stillness, a suspension of time where the world held its breath. And then, the sun returned not as a symbol of life, but as a blinding, searing orb of white light that turned the shadows of people into permanent etchings on the stone. In that microsecond, the laws of nature seemed to dissolve. The city did not burn. It evaporated. The shockwave was not a sound, but a physical erasure. When the news reached Tokyo, it was at first dismissed as an exaggeration, a trick of the light. But as the reports filtered in reports of a new kind of fire that left the skin of survivors hanging like rags, the finality of the situation settled into the bones of the leadership. This was not a war of soldiers anymore. This was a war against the very fabric of reality. The decisive battle was a fantasy. You cannot fight the sun with a bamboo spear. The final moment of realization was not the flash over Hiroshima, nor the second sun that rose over Nagasaki. It was a voice that the people of Japan had never heard, the voice of a god. On August 15, 1945, the airwaves carried a high-pitched, formal, and slightly archaic tone that vibrated with a very human sadness. The emperor, the descendant of the sun goddess, was telling his people that they must endure the unendurable. He did not use the word surrender. He spoke of the war situation having developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, but the euphemisms did not matter. What mattered was the sound of a god admitting defeat. In the rice fields, in the charred ruins of the cities, and in the frozen outposts of Manchuria, millions of people fell to their knees. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the history of the Pacific. It was the sound of a billion dreams of empire collapsing into the dirt. As the first American ships entered Tokyo Bay, the sailors looked out at a landscape that seemed alien, a world of gray ash and silent people. They expected snipers, they expected a fanatical last stand. Instead, they found a profound, rhythmic stillness. The Japanese people were not looking at them with hatred, but with a dazed, hollow curiosity. It was as if the entire nation had been holding its breath for a decade and finally exhaled. The sun did rise again, eventually, but it was a different sun, a human sun, stripped of its mythic armor, shining on a world that had learned, at a terrible price, that there is no glory in the fire, only the ash that remains when the fire is gone. The lesson of the falling sun is not one of military tactics, but of the weight of silence after the last bullet is fired, and the heavy, beautiful burden of having to survive the end of the world.